Sorry about that. I just had to do another part of this video because it cut off weirdly. So as I was saying, that is for the diagnosis, right? So you select the diagnosis, or if you want to select more than one because it's applicable, you can do so, and you can include any specifiers that you want for that diagnosis. Also related to that, remember there are diagnoses, as I explained in earlier videos, and I think in the PowerPoints as well. Sometimes you are torn between more than one diagnosis, and it is absolutely acceptable, right? There is even a code or two codes, which are the unspecified codes for those situations in which you feel the client meets almost all of the criteria, but there is more information that is certainly needed to make an accurate diagnosis. You can put those as rule outs, sort of as signaling me those are diagnoses that you considered. They could apply based on the symptoms that the client in the case study is manifesting. So you just put the word rule out, and then just do rule out ADHD, rule out conduct disorder. That is just for the diagnosis. For the diagnostic formulation, what I want to do is whatever you wrote in that initial diagnosis part, that can be done in DSM format using like bullet points or letters and numbers. It's pretty much just stating the diagnosis with any specifiers, any rule outs, and then we're going to move to the more narrative or written part, which is the formulation. So, what you do in that part is basically I want you to explain or justify what you selected as a diagnosis. So, it's kind of elaborating largely on what you wrote in that first part on the diagnosis. So, for example, if I say my client has um, major depressive disorder, recurrent or single episode with psychotic symptoms, when I go ahead and read your formulation, I want to see why do you think your client meets that criteria for that diagnosis? And the way you achieve that is by telling me the criteria that the client meets, right? For example, I selected this diagnosis because in the case study, it says, for example, the client is hasn't been sleeping for more than 2 weeks, or the client hasn't been eating well, or the client has been irritable, or the client has difficulty starting activities, right? I want you to sort of tell me from the case study that you're reading what in that case study are symptoms, problems associated with the criteria for that diagnosis. And that is what you're going to write in the case formulation. So, in a summary, basically, it's just telling me this is a diagnosis that I chose, and this is why my client fits in it, right? Because he meets criteria A, B, C, and D. And these are examples in the case study of each of these criteria, right? If, for example, ADHD, maybe you say your client has ADHD inattentive type. Okay, I'm going to match the criteria to the symptoms that I'm reading in the case study. And that's what I kind of elaborate, or that is a portion of what I do in the case formulation. Basically, just explaining and justifying why I gave that diagnosis to the client. And you do that by kind of explaining what criteria is the client meeting. And while you address that, remember you got to keep in mind that for a lot of this diagnosis, there are duration in terms of like limits of when you can start diagnosis or after when you should not diagnose. There's like onset of symptoms, when was that they happen, or what's kind of like the trajectory of the symptoms. So keep those in mind as you articulate your formulations. For example, for some of the disorders, major depressive disorder, it tells you that the symptoms have to be present for 2 weeks. So when I see your formulation, I want to make sure that you incorporate those elements, right? The elements of duration, of onset, and any other kind of time limit or duration or specific set of criteria for that disorder, right? Related to that, do not be afraid just because your client is very young. doesn't mean he cannot have a diagnosis that is traditionally associated with adolescents or older adults. There is what we call early onset. If you think a client meets criteria for bipolar disorder or bipolar disorder or a personality disorder, that is absolutely fine. You can just probably acknowledge that it seems that the client in the case study could be manifesting early onset. So I wanted to make that clear because sometimes students know the answer and they're afraid because they think, oh, I'm not sure if I should diagnose this because in the DSM it kind of highlights that this is more common in older populations. So just because it's common in older populations doesn't mean it doesn't happen with younger populations. And that's why prevention work is so important, or like capturing those children at earlier stages when they are manifesting behaviors associated to any disorder that's mostly associated with older populations. And then the other and last component of case formulation is kind of at the end, once you sort of explain your criteria and why you think the client should be diagnosed with that and why he meets criteria for all those specifiers. This is going to be particularly useful for those of you that are ruling out that you think there might be two diagnoses, or for those of you that are considering more than one diagnosis. What I want you to do is also explain, okay, why did I select this as a primary diagnosis and this one as a rule out? Why do I think the client then does not meet? Why do I think the client meets criteria for ADHD, but I'm not sure if he meets criteria for depressive disorder, right? Just give me a little bit of a justification. Why are you deciding to kind of rule out some disorders in terms of the primary diagnosis is ADHD, but I think we should rule out bipolar disorder or conduct disorder, right? Why do you think we should do a rule out of that case? What criteria do you think the client is meeting? What is making you uncertain? Just have kind of like that discussion, because that is at the kind of crux of diagnosing, right? It's a back and forth communication between many different professionals. And I want you to have the opportunity to experience that in a paper setting, right? In a paper format. Because that's exactly what we do. Sometimes we go back and forth with this diagnosis and we start saying, well, but, I think primary diagnosis is ADHD, but he meets a lot of the criteria for conduct disorder. So I want you to kind of write that in your exam, kind of like that debate that you're having about which diagnosis to select. And if you're considering multiple diagnoses, well, then you do the same, right? You explain again what is the criteria that the client meets for both diagnoses. So basically, in a summary, to wrap it up, case formulation is just explaining and justifying the diagnosis that you selected by kind of matching it to specific diagnostic criteria, right? The kind of specific criterion that it's labeled under each of this diagnosis. By the way, criterion are, for example, in ADHD, that would be the duration, time of onset, the actual symptoms, inability to sleep, inability to eat, difficulty starting the day or engaging in activities, being irritable, whatever it is that applied, that is what I mean by a specific criterion. And then you're going to go ahead and answer the questions, right? And for that, you could answer them right below each question, or you can just put a little subheading and continue answering your question. They're pretty self-explanatory. I'm only going to elaborate on the intervention part because I think risk and protective factors are pretty explanatory. There is even a PowerPoint. I think it's either, I cannot attest for sure, but it's either one of the first 2 or 3 PowerPoints. I think it might be one of the first 2. I kind of did a slide on different protective and risk factors for children and adolescents. Use that as a template, right? Because those are risks and protective factors for multiple situations in diverse settings. So I will use that as a guide. You can find them in the first or second PowerPoint for class 1 or 2. And you're going to, I think it even says it at the top of the slide, risk and protective factors. So basically, a protective factor can also be a risk factor, right? So family support could be a protective factor, and sometimes family can be a risk factor depending on the activities and values that the family is establishing for that child or adolescent, right? Church attendance could be a protective factor, but it could also be a risk factor for some adolescents. Other ones are, for example, parenting skills or parent discipline, or exposure to violence could be a risk factor. Academic achievement for some kids, participating in extracurricular activities. There are many things that protect us, and there are many things that put us at risk, right? The communities that we live in, our socioeconomic background, specific cultural values. Some of them can be both risk and protective factors. Others, for example, violence, exposure to violence, it's always a risk factors, right? So I just wanted to highlight that some of them can be both, depending on what it is that we're talking about. And in terms of the assessment questions that you might want to ask family members and Thomas, I'm not really concerned about this because I think a lot of you have enough clinical practice or direct practice experience for you to be able to formulate you. So I think this will be probably the easiest part for you guys, because it seems that the majority of students have had exposure of some sort to clients and have conducted assessments. Obviously, remember, the questions have to be related to the case study, right? You want to ask questions that further help you clarify, that can further influence the type of intervention that you design, that can provide more insight into the situation, but it's all tied to the case study that we are presenting here. Now, finally, in terms of the intervention part, one of the questions says, what areas would you target for intervention? So what I want to do is, based on the diagnosis and based on the formulation that you did, what do you think are the areas that you want to work on with that client, right? If my client has ADHD, if my client has anxiety, if my client has a generalized anxiety disorder or social anxiety disorder or a substance use disorder, whatever it is that my client has, what do I want to focus on, right? Based on the diagnosis and the formulation that I have presented. And how do I want to focus it, right? Do I want to engage the family? Do I want to do it individually? Do I want to do it in a group setting? Based on the information that you have in the case study. So first, you're just going to tell me what areas, right? Is it attitudes, thoughts, behaviors, feelings, or any other aspect? And then how are we going to work around it, right? How are we going to frame that? Do I want to do it individually? Do I want to do it in a family setting, in a group setting, or a combination of any of those? Then it says, please elaborate on the types of interventions that you would recommend for Thomas, the client. The selection of the interventions have to reflect an evidence-based practice approach, so please do a scientific search of the available intervention literature and incorporate sources in your answer. So this is kind of what we did in that homework, the discussion board post on evidence-based practice in depressive and anxiety disorders. It's kind of a little bit similar. So what I want you to do, and I already did a video on how to assess a literature correctly, but in summary, what I want you to do is, okay, these are the areas that I want to focus on, right? I'm going to focus on changing the thought patterns. I'm going to focus on helping build communication with parents. I want to focus on improving academic outcomes. Whatever it is the focus of your intervention, I want you to go find out some articles related to what you are deciding to focus on. For example, you want to focus on academic outcomes and the diagnosis you provided, or the primary diagnosis is ADHD. Go into the literature and do a little bit of research on ADHD academic outcomes in young children, in adolescents, right? So just put all the concepts that you're including in your intervention in a basic computer search, right? Okay, so I have ADHD, I have the concept of academic outcomes, and I'm working with children, right? And if there are other cultural layers, like it's a minority child, a child in the case study, you might incorporate those as well, right? Or if it's a male or a female, or from a single parent household, or a different type of arrangement. So go into the literature and see what's out there. You have a maximum, or I mean, a minimum of 4 sources, right? Go out there and see what's there in the evidence, right? And as you elaborate your answer, I just want you to kind of write, okay, Professor Diana, we're going to focus on academic outcomes. This is what I think we should do with the client in terms of academic outcomes, and this is what the literature says, right? I selected this outcome not only because it's appropriate for the client, but because there's a lot of evidence that the best way to address this outcome is through cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, parent-child therapy, whatever type of therapy. So basically, you're just gonna select a target, right? A goal of intervention. What set of things? It can be one thing. It can be more than one. What are my targets for intervention, right? Academic outcomes, changing thought patterns, helping express emotions, improving family communication, medication management, whatever you choose. And then you're going to go ahead and see what the literature says in terms of what is the best available intervention to address this. If I want to do family communication, improve communication skills, and my child has been diagnosed with ADHD or social anxiety, what does the literature says in terms of interventions available for ADHD kids or kids that are experiencing social anxiety? What does the literature tell me in terms of good interventions that are out there for this type of population, and for my target of interest, right? For improving communication skills for ADHD adolescents or children, or social anxiety children and adolescents. So what is out there in the evidence for this population and for my target of interest. It's the same of what like you do with a client. Your client, you diagnose him with bipolar disorder, and you go ahead and search the literature to see what interventions are out there for bipolar disorder for children and adolescents, and then you go even more specifically and search what interventions are out there for my specific target, right? So if I'm targeting helping a bipolar client regulate their emotions or reframe their thoughts, let me see what is out there in the literature in terms of bipolar disorder and reframing thinking patterns, expressing feelings and emotions. And then you're just going to incorporate that, right? You're just going to tell me, well, article X and Y provides good evidence because A, B, and C. The second article that I found addresses adolescents with bipolar disorder and uses this intervention. And the article suggests that the intervention is appropriate for, I don't know, minority children or Hispanic children or X and Y. So you're just going to incorporate what you found in the literature into your write-up, right? It's not super long, but just kind of reflecting, okay, this article or these 2 articles justify this intervention because A, B, and C, and it's appropriate because G, D, and F, right? And forth. So I hope that I made a little bit of sense in terms of the final exam. Please do ask me other questions as you're writing. I know it's hard to ask questions if you have not read the exam yet. I'm sure that as you read it, more questions are gonna pop up. So I'll be pretty available via email or by phone. Usually I answer phone calls between 9 a.m. and 5:30. If you call me after 5:30, I'll just return the call the next day, and then you can email me at any time as well. I hope this has been helpful. I know it's a little bit long, part one and part two, but please watch them both to get some answers for your final exam. Bye bye. Take care.